All right, how's it going? Um, I'm gonna share my screen here, and we'll kind of pick up where we left off yesterday. Um, all right, so this is the big picture of what we were looking at yesterday with the sarcomere, and again, the sarcomere is the one unit that a muscle cell will contract with. Notice the Z disc is the anchor to the sarcomere on both sides. The M line is right down the middle. Right here we see our thick myosin filament. We'll zoom in on that here a little bit today when we talk a little bit more in depth about myosin. But it's got these little golf club-like heads that are attached to it. That's going to be a big part of what happens when the muscle decides to contract. This thin blue area right here is called actin. That's the thin filament. And it's going to be these two thick and thin filaments acting together that allows your muscle to contract. I'm going to flip my screen here quick again. And you can see behind me a big picture of the sarcomere. The one up top here is a relaxed sarcomere, where it's big and long between the Z discs. Notice that the H zone right here is bare. There's no actin in it right now, and that's when the muscle is relaxed. Now, if we look at a contracted sarcomere down here at the bottom, that H zone is shrunk towards the M line, and the actual distance between the sarcomere with the Z discs is shortened. That's muscle contraction, okay? So changing topics from yesterday now to today, we got to talk about what happens to tell that muscle it's time to contract. So I'm going to go back to my screen share again here, go back to my desktop. So kind of like we had mentioned here, at rest, the bare zone in the H zone has no actin in it. Now, when we talked about the sarcoplasmic reticulum yesterday, that is basically this organelle that kind of bottles up and stores things, specifically in this case, calcium, because we're going to need that to help this process begin. So when skeletal muscle is told it's time to contract and to respond to its environment around it, we've got 4 different ways we can describe how it reacts. First is excitability. Excitability is the ability for it to respond to things around us, or what we call a stimuli. So the ability for them to receive that stimuli is what tells it to contract. Next, contractility, excuse me. That's the ability to shorten when that stimulus tells it it's time to shorten. Muscle cells also have the ability to be stretched and extend, and they're actually a little bit able to then recoil back to where they were before. And I say a little bit because if you stretch them too far, if you've ever pulled a muscle, you'll know that they can be pulled so far apart that they actually tear. But for the most part, muscle cells are elastic to a certain extent. So a skeletal muscle is stimulated by what was called a motor neuron. A motor neuron is just a fancy way of saying nerve cell. Now, when we put together that motor neuron with the actual muscle cells that are being stimulated by it, we have what's called a motor unit. So the motor unit is the skeletal muscle cells that are involved, the nerve cell that excites it, and that whole complex together. Now, what happens at the specific site where the nerve cell attaches to the muscle cell is what we're going to talk about next. So here's a good picture out of your textbook of a motor unit. So you can see coming out of the vertebrae are these nerve cells that then attach to the muscle cells and tell the muscle cell what to do. Here's a microscopic view of that. where you can actually see the nerve cells attaching to the muscle cell. So the point in which the nerve cell meets the muscle cell is called the neuromuscular junction. So what we have here is what's called an axon terminal. And if you think of terminal, you think of the end. Well, that's what this is with the nerve cell. It's the end of the road. It's where the nerve cell meets the muscle cell, which it's going to be acting upon. And here's a nice picture of that. Here's your muscle cells and the nerve cell that's coming across it. We'll talk later when we get to nerves about the importance of our nerve cells being myelinated. Myelin is kind of like the insulation that's around the nerve cell. Remember, nerve cells run on electricity, and if we want the electricity to run most efficiently, you're going to want to have a protective coating or wrapping around that electrical unit. So that's what the myelinated axon is of the nerve cell. Now, where the muscle cell and nerve cell actually come together, it's not a physical attachment. There's actually a little space between the nerve cell and the muscle cell called the synapse, or the synaptic cleft. So that is the gap between the nerve cell and the muscle cell. It's very important that we realize that the nerve cell does not attach to the muscle cell, okay? There's a space between there, and we'll talk about why that's important here and when we talk about the graded response that's coming from the electrical impulse of the nerve cell and how it's actually a chemical response that goes across the synapse to tell the muscle cell to contract. It's not just a boom jolt of electricity and it's time to react. It's what we call a graded response. It's an all or none as well when we get to that point later. So the synaptic cleft is the area between the nerve and the muscle cell that's filled with what we call interstitial fluid. That interstitial fluid is mainly based with water, but it also is loaded with sodium, potassium, calcium, many different ions that are associated with the interstitial fluid, all of which are needed during this response as well. So this is the $1 million picture. This is the one that you're going to want to get to know better. I'll show you a picture of it on the big board here when we're done as well. There's a lot happening at this point between the nerve cell right here and the muscle cell underneath here. Now, there's a lot of things to understand with what's happening with each of these. So the end of the neuron, like we said, it's the axon, and then the end, the synaptic cleft that's right here, is loaded with vesicles that have different chemicals inside there. Sometimes it's calcium ions. In this case here, it's an enzyme called acetylcholine, and that's labeled as ACH right here. Acetylcholine is the chemical messenger that tells our muscle cells what to do, okay? So if we kind of follow what's happening between these two parts, and we'll get through this in the next slides ahead of us, but what we have is an electrical impulse coming down the axon of the nerve cell to the synaptic cleft. If there's enough of an electrical charge present to tell a muscle to contract, acetylcholine is then spilled out into the synapse between the muscle cell and the nerve cell. There are specific binding sites on the muscle cell for acetylcholine to attach to. Now, when acetylcholine attaches to those binding sites, it sets off a chain of reactions that happen in the muscle cell that allow the muscle cell to build up electricity and to actually contract. We'll get to that here a little bit later. So a couple big words that I've used here in the last slide, we better describe. Neurotransmitter, okay? A lot of times your book, and even sometimes in our notes, will abbreviate neurotransmitter as capital N, capital T, okay? A neurotransmitter is a chemical that is released by a nerve cell upon the arrival of a nerve impulse. Now, the impulse is the electrical signal that travels down that nerve cell. We've got all sorts of different neurotransmitters inside of our body. In this case, the one that we're talking about is acetylcholine. It's the neurotransmitter that skeletal muscle is excited by. Inside of our brain to help us feel good each day, you've probably heard of dopamine or serotonin, epinephrine, norepinephrine. These are all neurotransmitters that we have running throughout our nervous system. So acetylcholine attaches directly to receptors on the sarcolemma, which is, again, the plasma membrane of the muscle cell. The sarcolemma, when it has acetylcholine attached to it, then becomes permeable. And what we mean permeable means able to pass through for sodium ions. Okay, sodium ions are positively charged, and anytime you have more positively charged environment on the inside compared to outside, you've got electricity, and things can happen. So here's just a zoomed in picture of what's happening between the nerve cell releasing acetylcholine, the acetylcholine attaching to its specific binding site on the sarcolemma, and when that attaches, it opens up the channel for sodium to come on in. If you remember back to like chapter 2, I believe we talked about the sodium potassium pump being one of the major enzymes or proteins that are located along our cell membranes. See, it's all kind of coming back together now. So sodium rushes into the cell, generating what's called an action potential. An action potential is a fancy way of saying an electrical impulse, okay? Once this is started, the muscle contraction cannot be stopped, okay? I mentioned earlier, muscle contraction is what we call an all or none response. Once there's enough electricity for a muscle to contract, it's gonna happen, okay? So here's another picture kind of just talking about how that nerve fiber excites the muscle cells. And this is found also on page, I believe, 191 in your textbook. All right, I'm gonna stop there in terms of new material. I'm gonna switch it back to the big board, and I'm gonna walk you through one more time all of the information that was in that big picture. All right, let me switch over my slide in the background too. So this big nose-like looking thing here, that's our nerve cell. Okay, nerve cells, and we're only looking at the end of the nerve cell. We're not looking at where the nerve body would be, where the nucleus is, and anything like that. Remember, nerve cells are made up of what we call the nerve central body, and it's got these little like hair-like looking things called dendrites that are all up by the nerve body that receive information from other things. And then way down at the very end, this big nose-like looking thing, this is called the axon. The axon is the part of the nerve cell that sends out the information to wherever it needs to go. In this case, the place it needs to go is a muscle cell, okay? Now, we'll kind of work our way through this whole process. The very first thing to happen is a nerve impulse travels down the axon to the synapse, okay, down here at that synaptic cleft area that we talked about earlier. When that nerve impulse comes down here, calcium-gated channels open up. And when calcium rush into the nerve cell, it kicks in our acetylcholine to be let out. And that's what we see happening. All these little red dots that are spilling out into the synapse are acetylcholine, okay? These little hot dog-like shaped things down here across the bottom, those are the binding sites on the sarcolemma for acetylcholine. And when acetylcholine attaches to those binding sites, the gate opens up. And when the gate opens up, you can see sodium rushing into the cell, creating a charged environment inside of the muscle cell, so that now this muscle cell is excited, and when that muscle cell is excited through electricity because of the sodium ions, it gets it to tell it to contract. Now there's a lot more that happens in that whole process to get the muscle to contract, but that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow with the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. I know it's a lot of information here, and it really is what I would call kind of a cause and effect set of reactions that have to take place. And if one of them along the way doesn't work, the muscle does not contract. Now that might not be that big of a deal if you're lifting weights and all that fun stuff, but if we're talking about Well, your heart, for example, that is an involuntary muscle. That's kind of a big deal. So we'll chat more tomorrow. Hit me up if you have any questions. Thanks.